Good evening and welcome to another episode of The Conversation. I'm your host, Kwame Thomas. Tonight, we delve into one of the most pressing issues facing our region, the devastating impact of Hurricane Beryl and the urgent need for improved climate resilience. We'll explore the factors behind Beryl's rapid intensification. We'll compare it to historical hurricane patterns and discuss the long-term implications of such powerful storms becoming more frequent due to climate change. Joining us are two esteemed guests, Professor Michael Taylor, climate scientist from the University of the West Indies, and Ms. Cherri-Ann Farquharson from the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. Stay with us for an insightful discussion. Welcome, one and all. Welcome to The Conversation, Professor Taylor. How are you?
I am good, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Yes, we should be hearing from Cherri-Ann Farquharson. Good evening, Ms. Farquharson. How are you?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me as well.
Yes, we're happy that you're here. So we just want to get into Beryl. Right now, we understand that Hurricane Beryl has caused significant damage right throughout the region. And one of the things that are surprising about this particular storm is, one, it's early, and two, it's that powerful. So we just want to start off, what are some of the key factors that would have contributed to Hurricane Beryl and its rapid intensification and the early formation in the Atlantic basin?
Sure. So one of the things about climate change, and I know we are linking Beryl to climate change, is that climate change we associated with things that are unprecedented. So if you think about global warming, you know, the region has been unusually hot, especially last year into this year. That's unprecedented. You think about, for example, 2013 to 2016, we have had drought, region-wide drought for multiple years. That's unprecedented. And so also in the realm of extreme events like storms, hurricanes, we get these unprecedented events. So unprecedented is the imprint of climate change. What then is, how does this relate to Beryl? Well, Beryl was unprecedented in a number of ways. I think you're beginning to touch on those ways. Mm-hmm. The first way is, of course, that it was Cat 4 and Cat 5 in June. So the unprecedented isn't the Cat 4 and 5. As a region, we have seen Cat 4 and 5 storms.
But it's in June.
In June is the unprecedented. A second unprecedented thing about Beryl is that it formed the Cat 4 and Cat 5 so far east of the Caribbean. So before it hit the Caribbean, in June again. So the in June is critical again. And then, of course, the third thing you mentioned, that we went to bed one night and Beryl was a tropical disturbance. And by the time you woke up the next day, it had reached Cat 4, you know, major hurricane status. So that rapid intensification is the unprecedented. So in that respect, Beryl has climate change imprints on it. What would have caused it, or what is a climate change imprint? Well, one of the overriding features this year, about June this year, is that the ocean temperatures are unusually warm. We are seeing warm ocean temperatures throughout the Caribbean Sea, going into the east of the Caribbean Sea into the tropical Atlantic, which are just abnormally warm. And these abnormally warm temperatures actually have been there for the last 12 months or longer. Climate change would have contributed somewhat, because climate change has been warming our oceans. Mm-hmm. It's not the only thing contributing, but that was the key fuel for the warm oceans, for unprecedented things about Beryl.
Are there any other contributing factors that you can pinpoint to say that these other things might be contributing there?
Well, you know, for this hurricane season in particular is projected to be an extreme hurricane season. And that's actually one of the frightening things about Beryl, that you could get Beryl at the beginning of the hurricane season in a season that is projected to be extreme. Why is it projected to be extreme? One, the very warm ocean temperatures. But there's also a little phenomenon that we often hear about called El Niño. and, you know, and its counterpart, La Nina. We have been having all of last year an El Nino, and El Nino is the warming of the equatorial Pacific Oceans. But when you put warm waters in the Pacific, because you know, the impacts don't stay there, they cause what we call strong vertical shear, or really how strong the winds are in, you know, and in opposite directions. In our region, we have been under the regime of strong vertical shear, but El Nino has now decided to come to an end. And so we're coming out of El Nino. And so the vertical shear that would pull apart, you know, clouds forming, is now weakening. And so you get the warm oceans plus the very weak vertical shear. It's just a kind of ideal situation for unprecedented and an extreme hurricane season.
So I'm no scientist though, but somehow that sounds to me that the drought conditions are going to be more exaggerated then.
Well, actually this season, when we have vertical shear, El Nino, we actually relate it to dry in the Caribbean. And for the very same reasons why we relate it to less hurricane activities. But now that we're coming out of El Nino, potentially going into La Nina, which is kind of the opposite, it means that we actually have good conditions for floods and heavy rains and extreme hurricanes.
So I'm not sure if Cherri-Ann would be able to address some of these concerns here, but I want to know from you, do you think that this would present any form of an advantage or opportunity for us as far as moving out of El Nino and coming into La Nina, if that might be anything as far as energy is concerned and energy resilience is concerned?
All right, interesting question, Kwame. So I want to go back to some of the things that Professor Taylor would have mentioned in terms of the unprecedented nature of Hurricane Beryl. Because what we have seen in the Caribbean, you have islands, particularly in the Eastern Caribbean, that are typically considered to be outside of the hurricane belt. Yeah. However, as Prof would have mentioned, you now have a strong hurricane forming before it enters the Caribbean basin. And so that concept of being outside of the hurricane belt is not as strong an argument as it used to be. And so you have islands which now need to look at how they build and what the resilience of their energy systems and their buildings actually look like because of this change in the regime. So in terms of moving out of an El Nino into a La Nina, one of the things that we have to consider is while having increased rainfall would be good for islands that have hydropower, for instance, when you have extreme events, when now you're not just getting good rainfall, but you're getting flooding, you now have another challenge. And we've seen where this kind of significant flooding in 2021 in Suriname, where they have hydropower dams, where the flooding was so intense that you actually had dams being breached and flooding communities. So you really don't want to experience either of the extremes, whether it is flooding or whether it's drought, because Belize experienced significant challenges with drought earlier this year, where their hydropower systems were not producing what they would normally produce. And then they now had to be pulling on other resources, and that got complicated, and eventually you ended up having blackouts. So what we want to avoid in an ideal situation with regards to our energy systems is to avoid the extremes. We would have seen in Jamaica when you had the heat wave last year, where JPS recorded their highest ever demand on their electricity system, because you had several things coming together. In addition to the heat wave, there was Saharan dust, which means persons who had their own solar PV systems were not producing as much as they would produce for themselves. And so they started to pull from the grid. Of course, if it's a heat wave, the fans, the air conditioning, every opportunity to get cool is there.
So there's a demand all around for power.
Right.
Whoa.
So we want to avoid the extremes as best as possible where the energy systems are concerned.
But how do we ensure that we stay within the margins? Because based on what you have just said, I would just say from a layman's perspective, the hurricane belt would have just widened. That's one thing. And then with the weather phenomenon that you have now described, it seems as though we need to figure out how to get our systems more agile. How do we do that?
All right, so there are several things that we do as it relates to building resilience in the systems. One of those things comes down to first planning and proper planning. So typically, when utilities are planning, they do what is called an integrated resource plan. But what we have introduced at the CEEN to the region is what's called an integrated resource and resilience plan. Now, with the resilience part of the plan, we start looking at what are the hazards and risks, what are the impacts of climate on your traditional electricity generators, as well as what's going to be the impact on your renewable energy systems. And then we start looking at building flexibility and diversity into the energy system. So you don't want to have all of your eggs in one basket. You want to be able to include as many of the resources as are available to you, whether it's going to be hydropower mixing with solar, with wind, with energy storage. And then there are other opportunities like microgrids that can help you to be able to make your critical infrastructures more agile, or give you the opportunity to repower individual communities. And I just want to say that, you know, the Climate Studies Group at Mona, which Professor Taylor leads, helps us with incorporating the weather and climate data into the planning process, so that when we're looking at the planning timeline for 5, 15, 25 years, that we're able to see how are things now, as well as how are they expected to change, so we can get the right balance and the right mix as it relates to the infrastructure, but also as it relates to being able to respond to disasters. So I had mentioned the microgrids. That's another critical opportunity. So you can imagine having a hospital that is able to function islanded from the rest of the grid. Mm-hmm. So I saw, you know, JPS, they were giving their reports as they were being able to restore power. But if you have these microgrids, that gives you the opportunity to focus on bringing back up your critical infrastructure, because they're in separate pockets that can operate in isolation of the general grid.
Pretty much then we're saying that this level of diversity that you're talking about would help in terms of agility, being able to pivot quickly. So you said something earlier about historical data, and so I'm now going to ask Prof. Taylor, in terms of the strength and timing of Hurricane Beryl compared to historical hurricane patterns in the region, how does the strength and the timing compare?
Well, I think we spoke about it being unprecedented. We have never had the category 4 and 5 in June at all, you know, so that's completely new, you know, the timing. And it therefore asks us to rethink how we think of a hurricane season. For example, Jamaica, if you look on, or if you just look on the hurricane season, the peak hurricane season would be, for when we get major hurricanes, would be late August going into September. Yeah. Suddenly, what we are now having to grapple with is that that norm is broken, you know, and we need to figure out, if things are not operating according to norm, what do we have to do to become resilient? Yeah. Yes.
So now that you've mentioned that now, and it's for both of you, so I'm not even sure who wants to take it first, but what are some of the long-term implications now of some of those such powerful early season hurricanes becoming more frequent due to climate change? And what does it mean for energy and energy resilience?
Well, let me start, and then I'm sure Cherri-Ann will take over on the energy part. So one of the things is that we have to grapple with the fact that, you know, what Beryl is teaching us, that when we begin the hurricane season, we can begin it with a bang. With a bang. And you know, I mentioned before, that's one of the frightening lessons we have to learn, because Beryl has come, it has devastated a number of Caribbean islands, but there is no guarantee that we will not get another one when the hurricane season would normally peak in August and September. So we now have to learn the lessons around dealing with having that. One of the simple lessons, you know, is that we are now in a mode of rebuilding after Beryl. But if there is a potential for another Beryl later in the season, how do we rebuild so that the infrastructure we are putting in place now will survive a category 4 and 5. And so one of the lessons is not just planning now, changing our mode of planning that we can get it this early, but it also means changing our mode of response. We have to have the systems in place to ensure that that roof we're putting back on the hospital, those utility infrastructures that we're putting back in place have the potential to survive going in another Beryl this very season.
All right, so we're going to hold, we're going to go for a first break, and when we return, we'll have Cherri-Ann Farquharson answering the rest of that question as far as our energy resilience is concerned. Continue to stay with us. You're watching The Conversation. Welcome back to The Conversation. Just before the break, Cherri-Ann, you were about to tell us, well, you're about to speak to energy and energy resilience as far as the Caribbean, the long-term implementations of powerful and early season storms are concerned.
Yes, I want to use an example to kind of highlight some of the things that we have to consider. And it's, as you know, Prof was talking about building back better and building back differently. So in Carriacou in Grenada, which was one of the islands that was hit directly and severely impacted, they were in the commissioning stages of a solar PV plant in Limlair. This is US $3.2 million worth of investment that was supposed to be saving more than US $100,000 a year to provide essential services on island. With that solar PV plant, which was just commissioned in June, has been completely destroyed. And so you need to consider the type of infrastructure that you need to use, because as I'd mentioned before, you can no longer say that they're outside of the hurricane belt and that when the storms are passing that they're going to be likely to be tropical storms. So you don't need to consider the racking systems that you would use in other jurisdictions that are likely to get strong storms, because we're seeing where you're getting major hurricanes in islands that were once outside the hurricane belt. Yeah. And so these are things that have to be considered. And the other thing that I want to say, Kwame, before you come back in, I am going to age myself when I share this. I recall Hurricane Gilbert in 1988. When after that storm passed, or the hurricane passed, I didn't get back electricity in St. James for 4 months.
4 months.
Yes. And so you can see that there were lessons that were learned. You'd have seen some of the light poles being changed and some of those things that are happening, so that restoration now is able to take place much quicker. So it doesn't seem quick for some persons.
No, I don't want to disrupt you or interrupt at this point in time, but I'm running a comparison myself, and you said 4 months in St. James, and I know of places where in a matter of hours, and then you have some places that did not lose power any at all right throughout the storm. So never mind that we heard locally that 65% of customers were without power, but right now, roughly 85% of them, as we speak, power has been restored. So it's a significant jump based on what you have just said. Never mind that you dated yourself, though. But go on.
Right. So what I'm saying is we've learned some of the lessons already, and what we need to do is we need to be able to replicate and share those lessons across the region. So you would have seen changing out of light poles from wooden to concrete. There are persons who've spoken about undergrounding some of the infrastructure as well. And one of the things that we have throughout the region, there is an emergency response strategy and action plan that was developed with CARELEC, which is the Corporation of Electric Utilities, supported by the CEEEN on the energy side and supported by CDEMA on the emergency response side, where we are able to come together to respond when these extreme events happen. And so you're able to deploy from the different islands, those that are not affected at a particular point in time, because at some point, all of us are going to be affected. So you have personnel being able to travel from the different islands to that point where it's needed to help with the restoration activities, and that is currently happening.
So I I no doubt think that based on the fact that the storm was powerful, the storm was early, it would have exposed some amount of inefficiencies in the disaster preparedness plans that we have. What are some of the gaps that were exposed, if you don't mind sharing?
All right, so some of the gaps that were exposed, and I'm not sure if I want to call it so much a gap as to say that I think as the climate changes, we have to be agile. We have to just adapt. Because I think there are some things that you can have some level of certainty with predicting, but there are some things that are unprecedented.
Simply
You're going to hear that word several times.
Exactly.
They're simply unprecedented. And so all you have to do is to learn as you go, and to be agile and to learn from each other, so that we can build better together. So we have building codes that can be shared. There is a regional energy efficiency building code that not just speaks to the energy efficiency, but also the structure of the buildings, that has been voluntarily adopted in some countries, that will help, because we recognize that these kind of buildings are not just required in Jamaica and in Haiti, where you get a lot of the storms passing through, but no, in the Eastern Caribbean, in the southern part of the Eastern Caribbean in particular. When you hear about Tobago being impacted by Hurricane Beryl, Trinidad and Tobago don't get tropical storms.
Again, you know, it's the same word. It's the same word, unprecedented. Right, but Prof wanted to say something earlier.
Let me pick up on something Cherri-Ann is saying. It's not a gap, but one of the things we have to recognize is that these documents, these approaches, these policies have to now become living documents. Because the truth is climate is changing. And even for us as scientists, climate is changing at a faster pace than even some of the projections that we had had. So yes, you create a building code based on the scientific projections for the now, but these projections are also changing. And so you always have to be going back and revising your disaster response. Yes, we have gotten the time without electricity down from 4 months to probably to 2 weeks. You know, we'll never be without an impact of a storm. But what now do we learn that we can get a Category 5 in June, and we can get it again in August? Well, maybe we now need to figure out, you know, what Cherri-Ann was talking about. We now need to decentralize some of the energy resources so that a hospital can stand on its own for those 2 weeks while it waits on the utility company to come up. Maybe there are remote communities that need to have their energy sources. And we can talk about other things as well. Talk about water, you know. Maybe the tanks have to be now a little bigger because of the changing. In other words, climate is changing and we have to learn now. We can't say we have responded to climate change in a document and leave it there. You know, we have to always make these things living documents and responses.
So in light of what you have just said now, and this is for both of you because of how closely you have to, is there a space now for greater collaboration between the scientific community in terms of providing the policymakers with the data that is required and the insights to strengthen our regional adaptation strategy?
Well, I think the obvious answer that, you know, is a yes, but you don't want to get me off now going on how much we have supported the scientific and research community. For example, in the region, there is no, for example, scientific research fund which to support doing exactly contextual science research to support the things that we need, you know, in the region. You know, we basically leave it up and say the universities must do that, but do it with what resources? You know, resourcing scientific research and resourcing the science community now becomes part of our adaptation strategy to climate, you know. And yes, you know, when we do produce the information, we now have to figure out the mechanisms to get that information utilized so that decision makers have it at the tip of, you know, tip of their fingers. Thankfully, we have a good working relationship with CEEN, you know, with CEDEMA, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, with other regional agencies, you know. But we also have to have that deep, close relationship with governments. Governments are the seat of planning, you know. There is clearly a need, to answer your original question, yes, you know, but I'll allow Cherri-Ann to come in.
You know, Prof, I definitely agree with you that there is definitely a need for closer collaboration. And we have seen where we are making strides working with the university. There is a regional universities network that we work very closely with. So not just with the UE, but with all the national universities across the region. And one of the things that we aim to do is that as we are doing the projects and as we're doing the policy planning, that we incorporate the research that's coming out of the universities as a part of the process. But again, the decisions are made by our parliamentarians, by our government. And so we have to ensure that it is distilled so that they can understand and grasp the urgency of the outputs of our scientific research so that we can close that loop and ensure that the funding also comes back in. Having been able to make those informed decisions, that the funding comes back in, because as Prof said, these have to be living documents, because the climate it's not that the climate will change or has changed, it is changing. So we have to continuously update what it is that is coming from the scientific community to inform the policies and the decisions that are going to impact the lives and livelihoods of the people in the Caribbean.
So the question that I want to ask as we ease into our break is whether or not we're late to the party, because we have always been in a hurricane region, hurricane belt. But then the question is, it's just a matter of time before something like this would have happened. So when we come back after the break, we want to find out about the early warning systems and how prepared we were, and whether or not we could have done better. You know, I know that improvement is the biggest room, that room in the house. You know, but we will be going to another break, and right after this, we'll continue with the conversation. You're watching. Right now, we're talking to Professor Michael Taylor and Cherri-Ann Farquharson, two climate specialists and energy specialists, I should say. So we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to the conversation. Just before the break, Cherri-Ann, we started looking at, or we were about to look at, the effectiveness of the early warning systems and emergency communication channels that were used during the hurricane, and what improvements do you think are needed if you're able to speak to those?
All right, thanks for that, Kwame. So the early warning systems would have begun even before Beryl was on the horizon. So the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, CIMH, along with their partners like the Climate Studies Group and the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, they would have put out bulletins before the hurricane season with regards to how active the season was expected to be. And that was supported by the data and the reports coming out of other meteorological organizations like the NOAA out of the US. So before the season started, we would have started to get an indication that this season was going to be unlike the others. And so just how unlike the others it was, I'm not sure if any of us were prepared for that. You know, we have the mantra that says June too soon, July stand by, August a must, September remember, October all over. So we don't need to teach that to children anymore, right? Because even though we had that indication, you know, we were not prepared for how early we would have needed to start mobilizing resources. With regards to Beryl in particular, you did have quite a lot of alerts going out from the Met services across the region. And I think just simple things, as I saw, several of them would have started WhatsApp channels so you could get updates on your phone just to know exactly what was going to happen. And I think as a region, though, Caribbean, a lot of us tend to be a little laid back. So even though we get these alerts because of what we are used to, then individually, a lot of us didn't necessarily respond as we should have. from the regional and the national perspectives, though, we did see the mobilization coming in with the defense forces, with the alerts that went out to the fisheries, and so I think we did respond quickly as we could,
Yes.
given that we didn't expect to be doing this kind of a mobilization so early in the season.
So, but then one of the questions that immediately come to mind, though, when you say that, I've heard and I've seen over social media and so that we don't take these phenomena so seriously, especially not so early, because June too soon. Do you think that that serves to add more difficulties or more hindrances to the work that persons like yourself or Prof. Taylor does? So work that both of you would be involved in, does it make it harder, the fact that we don't listen, we don't take it seriously, and so we don't take what you're doing seriously until it's perhaps too late?
I think it doesn't.
No, go ahead.
Well, okay, I think it doesn't necessarily make it harder, but I think what we have to do is we need to make sure that we think about the messaging and how we communicate it. So we probably just need to do it differently so that the message actually comes across and persons recognize that what we've always done, we cannot continue to do because we're not operating in the same kind of climate regime that we're used to.
And just to pick up from that last point there from Cherri-Ann, truth is, one of the things about Beryl was that rapid intensification that you spoke about.
Yes.
And so people, even in how we think about hurricanes, you feel that, well, it's a disturbance, even though it's projected to be a category 1 in the next 2 days. That rapid intensification took us by surprise. And so the time you had to prepare was significantly shortened. And so you were left scrambling to do that. We're going to have to begin to take that into account, as Cherri-Ann was saying in that last point. That's going to have to change how we do things. We know we have to clean drains consistently throughout the year. Cleaning of a drain is not going to be for the beginning of the hurricane season with the major cleaning going into August, September. You're going to have to deal with that. You're going to have to deal with other things that will, make us prepared almost year-round, because you can't predict the unprecedented and the unpredictable.
But I'm pairing this that you're saying now with what you have said earlier, well, what both of you have said earlier, and it's registering to me that we now have to rethink the whole idea of agility, and we have to now rethink how we approach these things full stop, because it can't be a case whereby we're going to be preparing for June. It must be a case whereby we have prepared and we're now going to maintain until June.
Right, so a lot of things have to change in how, and I think that's what climate change is trying to teach us anyway, and it's not just with hurricanes. Look, as Cherri-Ann spoke about, look on the intense heat that we have been going through, the real warming. Well, from the energy sector perspective, that is throwing up unprecedented demand. I think our utility companies will say that the demand where we are now this year is akin to what we were at when we were having that peak demand last year, which was later in the year. It really is asking us to rethink completely how we approach a lot of things in terms of planning and processes to deal with sectors that are very climate sensitive.
All right, thank you. So Cherri-Ann, what are some of the best practices or some of the lessons that have been learned or are being learned from the passage of Hurricane Beryl?
Okay, so one of the things that we've learned, we recognized it before Hurricane Beryl, but definitely we understand, is the intersectionality of all of our economies. So what has happened with Beryl has definitely had an impact on the energy sector, but then we're also very linked. It has an impact on tourism. It's had an impact on agriculture. It has a significant impact on fisheries. And all of these climate sensitive sectors now have to look at how they respond. So some of the lessons that we have learned with regards to Beryl and how we respond and how we get post-Beryl is that we have to make sure that our critical infrastructure is hardened as best as we can. So looking at making sure that you have independent supply for your pumping stations for the water sector. considering we spoke, previously about the microgrids for your critical infrastructure, like your hospitals and your schools. Because if this had happened in September, how long could we keep the children out of school without having electricity and water? And even though this has happened at the end of the school year, a lot of these schools are used for
shelters.
For shelters.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to make sure that we think about the different sectors and how each sector is going to be able to respond and to come back online. You hear a lot of talk about prices that are likely to go up for food because of the damage that has happened to agriculture, that has happened to fisheries. So it is definitely one of the things that we have learned, as Prof had said before, is that we can't look at getting ready at the beginning of the hurricane season. We have to stay ready. We have to be ready. We have to make sure that we are making our decisions based on the science that we currently have, and that as the science changes, as we're recognizing that things are changing, that we, in the same way, we respond to make sure that we can, because we're going to get the disasters. So what we have to do is to make sure we can get the different systems back online quickly.
All right. What do you think of that, Prof?
I agree. And we have learned exactly how vulnerable we are to something like, a Beryl, but generally to climate change. And that vulnerability spans every area of life. Very often we like to think about climate change and think, oh, it's a little rain or it's a little heat, and it's really the domain of the farmers, who have to deal with it. But what we have now learned is that it touches me and you, and it's everyday life. So it's water, it's energy, it's agriculture, it's the finance sector, and having to find the money now to recover. It's the biodiversity that's impacted. It's the education system. In Jamaica alone, there are at least two schools in the West that you question, how are they going to reopen? That's now a whole community that's impacted. So Beryl has brought home to us this intense vulnerability or extreme vulnerability that we have as small islands, perhaps even more so than the developed, and not even perhaps more so than the developed countries.
Wow. All right, so continue to stay with us. When we return, we'll be looking at exploring renewable energy solutions to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Continue to stay with us. Welcome back to the conversation, where we're going to be exploring renewable energy solutions and that we can use to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So just before the break, we started looking at all the sectors that were impacted as far as Beryl is concerned. What we want to find out now, what about the implementation of things like well, not solar-powered farms, but there are hydroponics, there are aquaponics, all those things where you can produce a lot more in a smaller space. Would those kind of measures be able to help to mitigate against something like a Beryl or another weather event like Beryl?
Well, I'm going to allow Cherri-Ann to speak to the energy sector, but picking up from where I was ending, now that we're seeing the vulnerability, across multiple sectors.
Yes.
Every single sector now has to go through and see what is it that we need to do in order to be resilient. So you think about the agriculture, you are talking about aquaponics. There is a context for protected agriculture, but making sure it can withstand a Beryl, But go right through. The water sector needs to think. That's personal storage, micro dams, other kinds of things. Go all the way down to even something like just the local government and social services. We need to deal with the fact that we have homeless people. Where do they go in a Beryl and a hurricane Beryl if this is going to become the norm? What are the social protection programs we are going to have? Businesses need to think about insurance, and especially in a regime where insurance rates are going to go up because we are in this new kind of climate regime. Every single sector or area of life has to think through what are those multiplicity of options. One of the things though is that we actually do have some of those plans.
Yeah.
Almost every country has done adaptation plans for their critical sectors. The health sector adaptation plan, you know, the question is now, we need to pull these out, make sure they are current, and then begin the whole task of mainstreaming their implementation.
So I think now, based on what you have said,
But remember, Cherri-Ann, we're going to talk to them.
no, and I think based on what you have just said, I have a brand new question for Cherri-Ann. No, so
I'm sorry, Cherri-Ann.
What I want to find out is, tell me, because Prof. Taylor, he is the scientist. You are a scientist too, but it so happens that you are now working from the policy perspective as well. So what kind of policy and regulatory changes are needed to incentivize greater investment in disaster resilience, disaster resilient infrastructure right across the Caribbean?
All right, so before I answer that specific question, Kwame, I want to put things into context. So in terms of disaster response, you're thinking of a country needing to find 40 to 60% of GDP. Prof. Taylor had mentioned, you know, some of the more developed countries, when they have to do disaster response, it's thinking 1 to 5% of GDP. So we need to recognize that it is going to be a significant setback when we have to do this kind of response and to do it so frequently. The premier of Nevis at a forum last week had mentioned that we're in essence being asked to cash a check that we didn't write. But that is a part of the reality that we currently face. And so we have to ensure that those policies, those plans, because we have a lot of them, as Prof has mentioned, that they're actually being implemented and that they're being consistently updated as more current data becomes available. So those are some of the things that we have to consider and we have to think about as we move forward. Another one of the things that we have to think about is that neither of us as Caribbean nations need to reinvent the wheel. And we are already stronger together anyway. So we can learn from each other. And that's one of the things that at the CARICOM level, we try to have a lot of regional policies and plans that can be adapted to the different national situations. We need to actually make use of these resources and making sure that there is funding that's going towards the implementation of these plans. These social services are actually in place at the local levels. Coordination is in place at the national level, that support is available at the regional level, and that this is something that is properly resourced and that we consistently make a priority, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Let me just jump in here. And Cherri-Ann, I wonder if you do agree with me that one of the things we have to do is use our status, small island developing states, to drive the narrative. Very often we sit down and we take the narrative that is given to us about climate change. For example, Cherri-Ann is in the renewable energy space. Renewable energy space globally is seen as a good mitigation response. You do it because you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because you don't emit, greenhouse gases. But certainly within the Caribbean, renewable energy has to be seen more than a mitigation and has to become a primary adaptation option for resilience. So that after an event like this, it is the renewable energies that gives you the immediate resilience to keep your hospitals up, to keep your police stations, to charge a little man's phone, etc. So we have to use our context now to begin to drive the global narrative on climate change, which very often we sit back and allow others to define it. I'm betting Cherri-Ann would agree with me there.
I agree with you, Prof, and I'd actually take it a step further, that beyond adaptation, making use of our indigenous resources actually can give us the fiscal space, drive our economies so that we are able to finance some of these responses ourselves, as well as transform the economic landscape. So for instance, when you look at a country like Dominica or St. Kitts and Nevis that has significant geothermal resources beyond what they would need for electricity in country. Now you can think of what other industries can be generated and transformed because you're now making use of this indigenous resource to help to drive economic change. And that can be replicated because all of us across the region, the same thing that makes us attractive to tourists is the same thing that we can use, the sea, the sun, the wind, that we can use to transform our economy so that we not only become agile and are able to adapt when there's a disaster, but that we can generate revenue to support our industries, to give us the social programs that are required and to transform our economies so that we become even less dependent, not just on the fossil fuel that's generating greenhouse gas emissions, but on the revenue that we have to be spending there and generating revenue for ourselves.
Wow. So Prof, you are a thinker. So it's more than just scientific community now. What role can private sector and civil society play in complementing government efforts to build some community resilience?
Well, but you know, the response has to be by everybody. It's not just by the government. It has to be a personal response by you as well. You have to take your own personal responsibilities for the house that you are in, the communities that you are a part of, and see how they can be resilient. Government will never have enough finances, period, to do everything. But the private sector can certainly play a role in driving resilience, starting with their own selves. You know, we are very much dependent on private sector and the outputs that they produce, whether it's for food or that kind of thing. So they have an opportunity, you know, to play a significant role in building resilience. You know. Same for the NGO sector, you know, especially in communicating messages, especially in rallying communities. Beryl clearly has taught us, you know, that we have communities that are remote. Probably the first line of resilience has to be organizing the community to respond in the middle of a disaster, you know.
Wow. So Cher, what we want to know now, because not many of us know of a CEEN, for example. What are some of the key initiatives that CEEN would be using to promote renewable energy and energy efficiency in the Caribbean region? And this is your opportunity now to just give us the information about CEEN, what it does, and how we can help.
Okay, so a big part of our mandate at the CEEN is capacity building and knowledge management, which means that our responsibility is to get the word out. So we do have our CARICOM Energy Knowledge Hub that has information on everything that's happening in the regional space, particularly as it relates to energy and the intersectionality between energy and climate. And those resources are freely available. We also have that responsibility to support the governments with their implementing their own policies. The CEEN was actually set up to accelerate implementation of renewable energy and energy efficiency projects because the CARICOM would have set the CARICOM energy policy since 2012, and out of that recognize that we're not implementing the projects fast enough. And that is what a big part of the mandate of the CEEN. But while we're supporting our governments to be able to implement the policies, we also offer project preparation support to the private sector, to small and medium enterprises who may want to make their own businesses resilient and to put in the energy efficiency measures and the renewable energy systems within their own facilities, offering support to communities. And so a large part of what we do is there are different layers. So we have the support we give to the government, the support we give to businesses and to individuals. A lot of the courses that we offer, they're freely available within our Knowledge Hub. So if you as an individual want to learn more about renewables, about electric vehicles, about energy efficiency, you can come to our website to get that information for yourself. But you can also reach out to us because we have a focal point in each of the CARICOM countries that we work. So you can reach out to us, usually through the Energy Ministry, so that you can get that support in your community. If there's a project that you have, usually we want a little bit more than an idea, but if all you have is an idea, we will support you in being able to develop that for your community from an idea to a bankable project, and then helping you to find the financing for it.
So the last question that we want to ask now, because we're out of time, would be what are some of the main barriers to the widespread adaptation of what you call renewable energy systems in the Caribbean, and how can we overcome these barriers? And that's a question to both of you, scientists in policy.
All right, so I'll start. So there are two barriers that I want to highlight. One of them is that you have to have the financing upfront. So you can consider for a renewable energy plant, most of the financing goes into the infrastructure costs. But once you've put in the infrastructure, the operation and maintenance costs are minimal over the lifetime of the project. So that is one barrier that is seen. However, we recognize that a lot of our banking institutions, and in Jamaica, even from the NHT, you're able to get support to overcome that barrier so that you're able to pay for the system over time. Another one of the barriers that we've recognized, particularly to large-scale projects, has to do with some of the regulations. And so we work with the government to ensure that there are supportive regulations that allow persons to not just put in the systems for themselves, but also be able to get a payback from the utility for the excess that they're able to generate. And also to ensure that as we have a competitive market, so that persons are getting the best price that they can get for electricity. And at the end of the day, all of the planning is actually, the plans are being implemented. I think that may be the third kind of a barrier that we have an opportunity to overcome.
Prof, are there any that you can see?
The only one I would add to what Cherri-Ann has said is information. We need to make sure, one, that there is the information that shows the benefits of doing these things. Show the information that tells you how you can go about, getting renewable energy systems, whether small scale to large scale. And since I'm doing information, therefore there's a role for the media, to make sure that information is not just after Beryl. It's always there. Climate change information is always there. So just getting the information out there.
All right, thank you very much. That's all for tonight's episode of The Conversation. Remember, the increasing intensity and frequency of hurricanes like Beryl demand that we take action now to build a more resilient Caribbean. Thank you to our guests, Professor Michael Taylor and Ms. Cherri-Ann Farquharson, for their invaluable insights. And to you, our viewers, for joining us. Do remember to stay connected with us on Facebook, Instagram, and on X. Until next time, I'm Kwame Thomas. Stay informed, stay safe, and stay resilient.